The news cycle treats each flashpoint as if it exists in isolation. 1 hour, it's a military action in Venezuela. The next, it's trade threats aimed at Mexico. Then warnings tied to cartel activity, renewed arguments over control of the Panama Canal, and rising tariff disputes with Canada. Each item is presented as its own crisis, its own justification, its own story. But taken together, they form something far more deliberate. These are not disconnected events. They are coordinated pressure points arranged across a single strategic landscape, and most commentary misses that entirely. This is not about personalities, elections, or partisan theatrics. It is about leverage. It is about who controls supply chains, trade corridors, energy flows, and financial systems across the Western Hemisphere. The official language calls it national security. Critics frame it as economic coercion. Labels aside, the mechanics are unmistakable. Control the routes goods move through, influence how energy is priced and sold, limit competitors' access to markets and infrastructure. For years, this pressure was applied slowly and selectively. Sanctions here, regulatory barriers there, diplomatic isolation when possible. That approach depended on time, patience, and a belief that gradual pressure would eventually bend outcomes. What has changed is the pace. Incrementalism has given way to acceleration. Negotiation is increasingly replaced by ultimatums, and economic leverage is enforced through direct, visible pressure rather than quiet, backroom maneuvering. The shift first became obvious in Venezuela, sharpened with Mexico, and now stretches across the hemisphere. Each pressure point serves the same overarching objective: reassert dominance over trade flows, energy access, and financial architecture within what has long been considered America's strategic backyard. The immediate question is not whether this approach can force short-term compliance. It often can. The deeper question is whether the long-term costs will outweigh those near-term gains. To understand that, you have to look past daily headlines and examine the connective tissue linking oil fields, manufacturing corridors, shipping lanes, and resource exports into a single system. When pressure is applied simultaneously at multiple nodes, the goal is not simply obedience from individual governments. It is the reshaping of an entire regional economic structure. Media coverage rarely reflects this. Networks jump from one crisis to the next, encouraging audiences to consume them as separate dramas. A raid here, a tariff threat there, a diplomatic dispute somewhere else. Focus on the fragments and the strategy disappears. But this is not reactive crisis management. It is a coordinated squeeze applied across a hemispheric economic battlefield. The timing is critical. Venezuela offered a military template. Mexico became the test case for trade leverage. Panama represents control over logistical choke points. Canada sits at the center of resource security. Each case plays a distinct role in a broader containment effort. To understand why this is unfolding now, you have to look at what quietly changed over the last 20 years. Since the early 2000s, Latin America has undergone a profound economic reorientation. China's trade with the region has surged from marginal levels at the turn of the century to hundreds of billions of dollars annually. This was not organic drift. It was the result of sustained strategy executed with discipline across leadership changes and economic cycles. While Washington was consumed by wars, financial crises, and domestic political turbulence, Beijing focused on ports, railways, energy grids, telecommunications, and long-term commodity contracts. China's approach differed sharply from traditional great power engagement. It did not demand political alignment or threaten isolation. It offered financing, infrastructure, and trade with minimal governance conditions. Roads were built, ports were dredged, power grids expanded. Markets were open for exports that had long been dependent on the United States. Over time, this created not just trade relationships, but structural dependencies. In 2000, American firms dominated infrastructure, finance, and technology across most of the region. Today, that landscape looks very different. China is now the primary trading partner for several major South American economies and a top partner for many others. More importantly, Chinese firms operate or finance critical systems that make trade possible at all. Electrical grids, rail corridors, port terminals, logistics hubs, and telecommunications networks increasingly bear Chinese fingerprints. These assets are not symbolic. They determine how goods move, how payments settle, and who holds leverage during disruptions. The opening of a massive Chinese finance port on the Pacific coast of South America marked a turning point. Designed to connect multiple countries directly to Asian markets, it bypasses routes long dominated by American-controlled logistics. This is not simply commercial competition. It is an alternative trade architecture coming fully online. From Washington's perspective, this represents a slow erosion of influence that diplomacy alone has failed to reverse. That context makes the current pressure campaign easier to understand. The objective is not merely to respond to individual policy disagreements. It is to disrupt the foundations of an alternative economic system before it becomes irreversible. Venezuela sits at the center of this effort because energy remains the backbone of global finance. Venezuela's significance goes far beyond production volumes. Its oil reserves are among the largest on the planet, and under external technical and financial support, its energy exports were increasingly priced and settled outside traditional dollar-based systems. That experiment mattered. For decades, global energy trade has reinforced demand for the US dollar, enabling cheap borrowing and immense financial leverage. If a major producer could successfully sell oil outside that system, it would signal that alternatives were viable. Such a precedent would not remain isolated. Other producers would follow. Demand for dollar liquidity would weaken, financial leverage would diminish. The issue was not ideology or governance. It was demonstration. The intervention in Venezuela was about stopping that demonstration before it spread. The timing aligned closely with new energy agreements designed to deepen those alternative arrangements. The operation also sent a secondary message. Military power had not been rendered obsolete in economic competition. For years, critics argued that influence now flowed only through trade and investment. Venezuela showed that force could still be used to enforce economic red lines when other tools failed. But force has limits, especially when applied to systems that provide real benefits to multiple parties. That becomes clear in the Mexican case, where manufacturing, trade, and supply chains are deeply intertwined. Mexico has become a critical node in global production networks, including those linked to China. Chinese firms have used Mexico as a manufacturing base, importing components, assembling final products, and exporting them north under regional trade rules. This arrangement benefited everyone involved. Mexico gained investment and jobs. Chinese firms maintained market access. American consumers enjoyed lower prices. Supply chains appeared regional while remaining globally integrated. The pressure on Mexico is not about traditional trade grievances. It is about preventing those arrangements from neutralizing broader trade restrictions aimed at China. If tariffs can be bypassed through regional assembly, their strategic value collapses. But Mexico's ties to China extend well beyond factories. Investment, infrastructure, telecommunications, energy financing, and even financial settlement mechanisms increasingly link Mexico eastward as well as northward. This is where pressure becomes a forcing mechanism. The implicit demand is simple: prioritize privileged access to American markets or continue deepening economic integration elsewhere. That choice may seem obvious in the short term, but it carries long-term consequences. Coercion encourages hedging. Hedging encourages diversification. Diversification reduces leverage. And this dynamic does not stop at Mexico's border. Panama illustrates what happens when infrastructure quietly changes hands while attention is elsewhere. The canal is not just a national asset or a symbol of sovereignty. It is one of the most important commercial choke points on the planet, with a significant portion of global maritime trade passing through it every year. For most of the 20th century, American influence over canal operations was assumed, first through direct control and later through treaty arrangements that ensured strategic priority. That assumption no longer holds in the same way. Over the last 2 decades, Chinese shipping companies have become some of the canal's most frequent users, and Chinese-linked firms have invested heavily in port facilities, logistics hubs, warehousing, and cargo handling infrastructure on both ends of the waterway. None of this triggered immediate alarm because it unfolded through commercial channels rather than overt political agreements. The operations were efficient, profitable, and largely invisible to the public. But commercial dependence becomes strategic vulnerability when geopolitical competition intensifies. If tensions escalate, influence over ports, terminals, and logistics chains can translate into leverage over trade flows. Delays, prioritization, pricing, and access all become tools. The concern is not that the canal would suddenly be shut down, but that subtle forms of control could shape outcomes during moments of crisis. Once those dependencies are fully embedded, reversing them becomes extraordinarily difficult. The renewed rhetoric around reasserting influence over the canal is not nostalgia for a bygone era. It reflects recognition that choke points matter most when alternatives are limited. Shipping routes, unlike digital systems, cannot be rerouted overnight without cost. The pressure applied to Panama is designed to halt further drift and reestablish influence before commercial presence hardens into strategic constraint. It is a preemptive move, not a reactive one. Canada occupies a very different position in this landscape, but the logic is the same. It is a resource anchor. Energy, minerals, agriculture, and critical materials flow out of Canada and into American industrial systems with a level of integration unmatched anywhere else in the world. For decades, this flow was treated as automatic. Geography, infrastructure, and regulatory alignment made north-south trade the default setting. American refineries were built to process Canadian crude. Manufacturing supply chains assumed Canadian inputs. Food systems incorporated Canadian exports as a given. What has changed is not Canada's resource base, but its options. Asian demand for energy and raw materials has expanded rapidly. Export routes have diversified. Investment has followed those routes. Canadian firms increasingly sell to global markets rather than a single dominant customer. From a business perspective, this is rational risk management. From a strategic perspective in Washington, it introduces uncertainty. In a crisis scenario where supply chains are stressed and alliances tested, assumptions about automatic access no longer feel secure. The pressure applied to Canada is rarely framed this way. It appears instead as trade disputes, regulatory disagreements, or tariff battles. But underneath those arguments lies a deeper concern about ensuring that critical resources remain firmly embedded within an American-centered system. The logic assumes that proximity and market size will ultimately override diversification. But as alternative markets grow and infrastructure adjusts, that assumption becomes less reliable. What makes this strategy distinctive is how broadly it is applied. Brazil faces scrutiny over environmental policy and land use, but it has also become China's largest trading partner in the region and a major participant in infrastructure and energy cooperation. Chile encounters disputes over mining rules and trade terms, while deepening its integration with Asian markets and non-dollar settlement mechanisms. Colombia hears warnings framed around security and narcotics, even as Chinese firms gain footholds in ports, energy, and logistics. Argentina confronts financial pressure amid efforts to restructure debt, expand trade settled in local currencies, and align more closely with alternative economic blocs. In each case, the surface issue differs. The underlying pattern does not. Countries that remain tightly aligned with American economic structures face limited pressure. Countries that diversify meaningfully encounter escalating demands across multiple policy domains. The objective is not to resolve individual disputes. It is to force alignment by increasing the cost of alternatives. This approach rests on several assumptions that deserve scrutiny. The first is that pressure can undo 2 decades of structural economic change. Infrastructure, once built, does not disappear when political winds shift. Ports, railways, power grids, and digital networks shape trade for generations. The second assumption is that countries will accept reduced autonomy in exchange for stability, even when diversification offers protection against exactly the kinds of pressure being applied. The third is that coercion can produce durable cooperation rather than temporary compliance. There's also an assumption that American leverage will remain unmatched, that alternatives will always be less attractive, less efficient, or less reliable. But alternative systems are improving precisely because pressure makes them necessary. Financial settlement mechanisms outside dollar-dominated networks are becoming more sophisticated, regional development banks are expanding, currency swap agreements are proliferating, digital payment platforms reduce reliance on legacy systems vulnerable to sanctions and oversight, The response to pressure is already visible. Countries that once viewed diversification as optional now treat it as insurance. Energy exporters explore pricing mechanisms that reduce exposure to intervention. Manufacturing hubs seek supply chains that cannot be easily disrupted. Governments pursue trade agreements that bypass traditional gatekeepers. None of this happens overnight, but each step compounds the next. The paradox is difficult to escape. The more pressure is applied to prevent alternatives, the stronger the incentive becomes to build them. Measures intended to preserve dominance accelerate the conditions that erode it. This does not mean pressure never works. It often does in the short term, but it reshapes incentives in ways that are difficult to reverse. The hemisphere now stands at a crossroads shaped by these dynamics. One possible outcome is reintegration, where pressure is paired with compelling alternatives, and countries choose alignment because it delivers clear advantages. Another is fragmentation, where competing economic blocs harden and regional cooperation becomes collateral damage. A third path would involve accommodation, accepting a degree of economic pluralism while safeguarding critical interests through negotiated frameworks rather than coercion. The current trajectory points most strongly toward competition rather than balance. Pressure is applied broadly and simultaneously, encouraging coordination among those being pressured. Regional forums expand, payment systems evolve, trade patterns adjust. What begins as tactical enforcement risks becoming strategic overreach. This is the deeper story that rarely appears in headline coverage. Not isolated crises, but a systemic contest over how economic power is organized, enforced, and resisted. What unfolds next will not be determined by any single country or policy decision. It will be shaped by whether pressure continues to substitute for attraction and whether the incentives being created today produce compliance or quietly lay the groundwork for a very different economic order tomorrow. The long-term consequences of this approach extend far beyond the Western Hemisphere. What is being tested here is not only regional influence, but the viability of pressure as the primary instrument of economic statecraft in a multipolar world. For decades, the assumption underlying American economic dominance was that access to its markets, its currency, and its security umbrella was inherently more valuable than any alternative. That assumption is no longer universally shared, not because the United States has become irrelevant, but because other options now exist. When countries believe they can participate in global trade without relying exclusively on a single financial system, a single currency, or a single set of institutions, the balance of leverage shifts. Economic relationships stop being automatic and start becoming conditional. That does not eliminate American influence, but it transforms how that influence must be exercised. Pressure becomes more expensive, compliance becomes less durable, and every act of coercion carries informational value for third parties watching from the sidelines. Venezuela demonstrated that deviation from established financial norms could provoke direct intervention. Mexico learned that deep integration can come with political strings attached. Panama is discovering that strategic geography invites scrutiny and pressure long after formal sovereignty is established. Canada is confronting the reality that even close allies are not exempt when resource flows begin to diversify. These lessons are not confined to the countries experiencing them firsthand. They are being absorbed across the region and beyond. As these lessons accumulate, governments adjust behavior. Central banks explore currency arrangements that reduce exposure to external control. Trade ministries prioritize redundancy over efficiency. Infrastructure planning emphasizes optionality rather than optimization. What once might have been dismissed as hedging becomes standard policy. This does not require hostility toward the United States. It only requires a rational assessment of risk. At the same time, alternative institutions gain legitimacy simply by being used. Payment systems outside traditional clearing networks process more transactions. Development banks without political conditionality fund more projects. Bilateral agreements settled in local currencies become routine rather than exceptional. Each step is small in isolation. Together, they represent structural drift. The challenge for the United States is that dominance maintained through pressure looks very different from dominance maintained through attraction. The former relies on enforcement and deterrence. The latter relies on opportunity and trust. Enforcement can compel behavior, but it rarely builds loyalty. Trust, once eroded, is difficult to restore. When countries feel compelled rather than chosen, they plan for exit options even while complying. None of this implies an imminent collapse of American influence. The dollar remains central. American markets remain indispensable. U.S. military power remains unmatched. But systems do not fail all at once. They evolve, adapt, and sometimes hollow out quietly before the consequences become visible. The danger is not immediate loss, but gradual erosion masked by short-term wins. The pressure campaign across the hemisphere reflects confidence in the ability to dictate outcomes. It also reflects concern that time is no longer on Washington's side. When strategies accelerate, it is often because leaders believe the window for shaping the environment is closing. Acting now feels preferable to negotiating later from a weaker position. Yet speed cuts both ways. Rapid pressure leaves little room for managed compromise. It forces binary choices where nuance might have preserved alignment. It compresses timelines for response, pushing countries toward solutions that may not be optimal but are independent. Once those solutions are built, they do not disappear simply because pressure eases. This is why the current moment matters. The question is not whether individual disputes will be resolved, but what habits of behavior are being formed. Are economic relationships becoming more conditional, more transactional, more securitized? Or can space still exist for overlapping partnerships without triggering confrontation? If the answer is constant pressure, then diversification will continue. If the answer is accommodation paired with competitive offers, outcomes may look very different. Influence earned through value is more resilient than influence enforced through fear. That has always been true, even when alternatives were weaker. The hemisphere-wide strategy now unfolding is, in effect, an experiment. Can systematic pressure reverse long-term diversification without triggering acceleration of the very alternatives it seeks to suppress? Early signals suggest the outcome is mixed at best. Behavior changes quickly, incentives change permanently. What began as isolated headlines now reveals itself as a single narrative arc, a contest over who sets the rules of trade, finance, and infrastructure in a world where no single power can assume permanence. The decisions made in this phase will shape not only regional economics, but global expectations about how power is exercised in the decades ahead. Because once countries learn how to operate without depending entirely on any one system, they rarely choose to unlearn that lesson.